Good evening. Thank you very much for coming. My name's Jan McVarish. I'm the Education and Events Director of the Free Speech Union. Thank you very much for coming. And it's so good to have so many members here. We had almost 600 people registering tonight. This is our first attempt at a big online event for all members. And so really, really grateful to see people giving it a go. It's a bit of an experiment. So if there's any glitches, our apologies, but we'll iron them out over time. So this is the first of our online speakeasies, and we'll be hosting those every other month. So in between the speakeasies, we'll also be hosting Free Speech Union in-depths, and there'll be events during which we can draw on the expertise of our research and legal teams. So in June, we'll be hosting an exploration of the government's online harms bill with Radomir Talkoit, our Director of Research, and a panel of speakers. And so that'll be a very serious event at which you can grill our experts on a really, really pressing piece of legislation that's very, very significant for free speech. Then in July, we're delighted that our second online speakeasy guest will be Professor Kathleen Stock of the University of Sussex, who will, I'm sure, be known to you all probably as someone who's well and truly stuck her head above the parapet over the last couple of years and has really stood her ground on free speech in a way that has both allowed her to carry on speaking freely, but also has defended the rights of other people to speak, and has been an incredibly important figurehead for some of the kind of crisis aspects of what's currently going on around free speech. We're just beginning to plan our free speech, so our event schedule. And so we're looking to do comedy nights. Some of you might have come to our comedy nights last year. We're hoping to do some more of those later on this year. We'll be doing large debates with international speakers. And also, as soon as we're able to, we'll be doing local and regional get-togethers for members to meet each other and to host speakers and experiment really with how we can get a network of Free Speech Union members active at a more local and regional level. Our guest this evening is Quentin Letts. Quentin's been a Fleet Street journalist since the mid-1980s, and he's been a diarist, a foreign correspondent, columnist on The Telegraph, The Mail, The Times, and he's currently parliamentary sketch writer for The Times and theatre critic for The Sunday Times. He started writing parliamentary sketches when Mrs. Thatcher was Prime Minister, and is now on his 7th PM, some of them more memorable than others, I'm sure I've forgotten some of them. And there have been various attempts to cancel him over the years, and perhaps you'll share some of those while he's talking to Toby tonight. He's also the author of a number of books, one of them 50 People Who Buggered Up Britain, another Patronising Bastards, and his latest book, which is what prompted me to think he would be an ideal first speakeasy guest, is called Stop Bloody Bossing Me About, Why We Need to Stop Being Told What to Do. He'll be talking about all of this and why he thinks free speech is such a vital issue for our times with General Secretary of the Free Speech Union, Toby Young.
Thanks, Jan.
General Secretary, Toby. It's like being next to Brezhnev. Good evening, everyone.
Good evening,
Yes.
and thank you for joining us. I hope you can actually see us, but we're actually broadcasting from my shed in Acton, in front of a blind. It may look quite professional, but we're just in a garden shed, essentially, on a fairly amateurish setup. I hope nothing goes wrong. Well, it gives me enormous pleasure to be interviewing Quentin this evening. I've known Quentin for, I think, at least 30 years, probably a bit longer.
Far too long, yeah.
I think we came up together in Fleet Street. You've of course gone on to far greater things, but we started out at roughly the same time, I think.
Yeah.
And tonight we're talking about Quentin's.
We look like the two old men from the Muppets. Anyway, here we are.
Waldorf and Statler. We're talking about this book, which is Stop Bloody Bossing Me About. And if you would like, I can highly recommend it. And I would urge you to buy it, either by going to Amazon, but if you don't want to enrich Jeff Bezos, by going to your local bookshop and supporting your local bookshop owner. So, Quentin,
Toby.
So has it been difficult launching a book? I mean, it was published in February.
Bloody hopeless. Launching a book in the pandemic.
Has it been
absolutely
really
hopeless? We aimed for a February deadline, and it was going to be launched in February so that it would be in the bookshops in time for Easter. Well, the bookshops were closed. So that was a bit of a disaster. But you know, we fight on. We fight to win.
And have you done? Is this your first sort of event, as it were? Or have you done?
No,
lots
I've done one or
Zoom
two. No, I know. I'm hopeless at Zoom. I have done one or two.
Okay.
I'm very glad that you're that Jan is in command of the visuals. But I've done one or two things. But you know, there's not much you can do. And you know, reviews in newspapers help a little bit. But word of mouth is perhaps the only thing these days. And being in this shed is, I must say, gives it a slightly Samizdat feeling.
It does a bit, yes, yes.
Here we are behind enemy lines, deep behind enemy lines in West London, and that's really the way that the Free Speech Union operates, I guess, is word of mouth and people seeing what you do. And there is this strange feeling out in the world at the moment, certainly in Britain, that we are operating somehow despite government. We're speaking out despite the government and against the government. It's a very strange feeling at the moment.
Yes, I sometimes distrust the opinion polls showing how much support there is amongst the general public for the lockdown restrictions, because so many people seem to be blindly ignoring them. It's as though when the opinion pollsters ask them the question, they think it's a question about whether other people should be social distancing and not about whether they should. So they're perfectly happy to say, well, yes, I think other people should, but it doesn't mean that they're actually observing the rules themselves.
Yes, the government's operating at the moment a lot on focus groups. And the thing about focus groups is the focus groups are, we hear about the conclusions, but we don't necessarily see the way that the conclusions are reached. And in a focus group, there is peer pressure on people, the way that there isn't in other ways of measuring opinion. And Boris, I'm afraid, has been taking a lot of notice of these focus groups, and he's been, you know, the departments are helping. But when I said earlier the government, one's feeling against the government, it's not just the government, is it? There's a wider, what I call in the book, the bossocracy, who are people who are trying to tell us what to think and certainly what not to say. And it's officialdom, it's the arts class, it's celebrities, and it's the quangocracy. And there's this strange sort of pod of people at the top of British life who are wagging their fingers at us and telling us off the whole bloody time. And I'm like that old Adrian Henry poem. I'm just about at breaking point. She snapped.
Well, I was going to ask you, that was going to be my first question. You say in the book that you wouldn't describe it as a libertarian book.
No, I'm not a libertarian.
And you accept the basic contract between subject and crown. You pay your taxes and take them discreetly. You say rules often make sense. And then you say, but then there comes a point. And I wondered if there was a particular event, a particular story that pushed you over the edge, that made you think enough is enough. I'm not going to take it anymore.
There were three things. I sound like Keir Starmer when he said the other day, fifthly on television. But there's a staircase at Swindon railway station. When you get out of the Swindon, on the in order to change trains onto the Cotswold line, there is a machine, an automated machine that shouts at you on the staircase and tells you to hold on to the banisters. And that really bloody annoyed me. And it says, when on the staircase, please hold on to the handrail. So they even get the emphasis slightly wrong.
And
so
that's said in the voice of Harriet Harman.
Yes, it does actually. Something very similar. And then there was also the case of Fenton the dog. I hope that the audience will know the case of Fenton the dog, which is big on YouTube, and it's about a man taking his dog to Richmond Park, and the dog runs amok and causes a stampede of the deer in Richmond Park. Now, whose side are you on? I was very much on the side of Fenton the dog. I had a tremendous moment of liberty. It's a screamingly funny YouTube clip. But if you're on the side of Fenton the dog, then you're with me. But if you're on the side of the owner, then I'm afraid you're on the side of the bossocrats. And what made that story even more blissful, you see this dog at last gambling and having its freedom, is the fact that Fenton the dog used to be a guide dog for the blind. And so finally, after years of being told what to do by its owner and being obedient and being civic minded, it was just running malaki. And I loved that. And then the third thing that really got me was when at the start of lockdown, there was the disclosure that SAGE was operating on the basis of trying to instill fear in us. And there was one of the SAGE subcommittees There's this is all detailed in the book.
SP1B.
That's the one, and it talks about how a substantial number of people still do not feel sufficiently personally threatened, and therefore they had to ramp up the emotional messaging. And I thought, my God, it really is that calculated. They're trying to force us into actions by manipulating our emotions. And I thought, I just can't bear this anymore.
And curiously, one of the people on SP1B, and who I think had a hand in writing the words you just quoted, is Susan Michie.
She's the communist.
Who is, in addition to being a psychology professor, I think at UCL, is a member of the Communist Party of Great Britain. How did Boris come to be relying on the advice of someone who's a member of the Communist Party of Great Britain, given that he has a majority of 80?
Yeah, well, he's a politician, though, and politicians always do anything they need to do to stay popular or to stay powerful. I think that's how that happened. I mean, it doesn't really worry me that she's a communist. To my mind, there's nothing wrong with being a communist. It's when you become a communist didact and start telling people what to do, and also taking away their liberties. And free speech is a terribly important part of this, because free speech is dissent, is it not? And if you take away the right to dissent, you're taking away the right of people to suggest to government that maybe they are wrong. And if you take that away, you're taking away the possibility of policies being improved. And it's absolutely vital to have a lively parliament, say, where dissent is evident and where people are heckling and all that stuff. Really important in order to make ministers better and to make them better, because they get frightened of the heckling, and it makes them better informed if they know that they're going to get a hard time in parliament. And if you take all that away, if you take away that free speech and the right to argy-bargy, then you end up with worse policies. And that's what's happened, because our parliament has been completely knackered by this. The House of Commons has been turned into a complete milquetoast, and it is a bad reflection on our democracy, what's been happening.
One of the arguments against people like me, who've been fairly critical of the lockdown policy, is that this isn't peacetime. Different rules apply now. You can't go around publicly criticizing the government's handling of the epidemic in the UK, because if people don't abide by these rules, if you sow seeds of doubt about the effectiveness of the lockdown policy and the need to socially isolate, well, it would also lead to people dying. That's the argument. That this speech, will lead to harm, and they justify restrictions on free speech and Ofcom's coronavirus guidance and the demonization and smearing of lockdown skeptics. The rationale for all of that is that during the pandemic, we can't have these skeptical voices running amok, because they will cost lives.
Well, it's total balls. Total balls. For two reasons. One, people have been dying as a result of lockdown health policies. They've been dying of other conditions in far greater numbers than would have been the case. And also, if you look back at the Norway debate, 1940, was it, in the House of Commons, tremendously vexed arguments were being put at a time of warfare, and the government was being attacked by parliamentarians in a really lusty way. And so if that happens in 1940, then why the heck shouldn't it happen in 2020? And it didn't, because there was this emotive pressure put on people by the slightly spooky Spy MB committee of SAGE.
Do you think one of the reasons the government has been able to get away with suspending our liberties on a greater scale than they've ever been suspended during wartime, to paraphrase Lord Sumption, is because they have at their disposal now, which they didn't then, tools of propaganda? They have this enormous budget, for one thing, at their disposal to pay for. They've spent hundreds of millions of pounds on messaging designed in part to terrify people into complying with the government's guidance. But in addition, they've used these various covert psychological techniques without a kind of care in the world. We're completely justified in using behavioral psychology in order to get people to comply, because it's for their own benefit, it's for their own good. I mean, in peacetime, governments wouldn't get away with being able to use those subliminal psychological techniques to kind of win over people to kind of endorsing the government's handling of a crisis.
Well,
but during this crisis, they've been able to do that. And is that partly why, do you think, the British public has largely put up with the suspension of their liberties?
I don't know. I don't know the history of psychological manipulation in government circles. I don't know about that. But I suspect, I've got a nasty feeling, you know, that the opposition to Hitler was a close run thing in the 1940s. And, you know, Warden Hodges of Dad's Army is a great lesson to us, yes, because he has now become a COVID marshal, has he not? And he is that bloody man who in the crematorium in Milton Keynes came bursting out of the back of the building of the room and interrupted a funeral because somebody was comforting, two blokes were comforting their widowed mum. That was an obscene moment, was it not? Horrible. And I think that the Warden Hodges mentality has perhaps always been there, and has just been, you know, perhaps we haven't been brave enough this time to stand up to it.
In my notes of questions to ask you, I've written down Warden Hodges and underlined Warden Hodges.
But some of the adverts have been really disgusting. I mean, I listen to Classic FM quite a lot, and the sort of emotional topspin on those adverts, sort of saying, do you really want to kill your grandmother? That sort of thing. God, it's bad. It's really bad. And I don't think that would have happened in the 1940s, perhaps because people weren't as daring the propagandists weren't quite as daring in when it came to emotions.
Well, it's the sort of thing that Warden Hodges might have said, but is ridiculed for saying in Dad's Army. He's a sort of comic figure, isn't he? A kind of
comedy is the best way comedy is the best answer to them. Taking the piss out of people is always the best solution. But, you know, that has been made much harder because comedy is now almost exclusively a right-on woke area. And the comic undermining of officialdom has been left to a few memes on social media. There's been none of it on the BBC. The BBC has been tremendously orthodox.
Yeah. Well, let's return to Warden Hodges. If we think of the
does everyone know who Warden Hodges is?
Well, perhaps we should explain, actually. Do you want to?
He's the ARP, he's the Air Raid Patrol warden in Dad's Army, who's always saying, put that light out, and he's also a tremendous little Napoleon.
That's right. And the conflict between Warden Hodges and Private Walker, who is
Private Walker's the Spiv. Yeah.
Who's always catching
his egg.
Yeah, and he's a sort of black marketeer who can kind of acquire stockings and chocolate and so forth for members of the Dad's Army. That conflict between Private Walker and Warden Hodges is sort of, that schism has been present in the sort of British character going back, you know, hundreds of years. We almost fought a civil war.
Goes back to the Normans.
Certainly goes back to the Normans.
Yeah. And the Normans against the Anglo-Saxons.
Yeah.
I think.
And I think certainly the pandemic has empowered the Warden Hodges in our midst and disempowered the Private Walkers. But actually it seems to predate that, and your book is about it predating that. We seem to have become a culture beholden to these sort of professor of this and that, but who is essentially Warden Hodges for some time. Why do you think it is? I mean, particularly in light of, the Brexit revolt. I think we thought for a bit,
it's amazing Brexit,
that Private Walker was in the ascendant, and Warden Hodges had been put back in his box. Well, and we hoped with Boris that we might see a more kind of, think of it as the conflict between Sid James and Hattie Jakes, and Boris as Sid James. And we thought that, Sid James, Private Walker was in the ascendancy, and yet suddenly Sid James has turned into Hattie Jakes.
Actually, I think Sid James did have a bash at Hattie. But I think actually you're misreading it slightly, Toby. I think we say Brexit was extraordinary that the British people revolted against being told what to do, but maybe that is the reason that officialdom has been so bloody determined this time to seize back power. I think that's got something to do with it. I think actually there was also a bit of echo coming from America, where officialdom, the official class, were really determined to get rid of Trump. And that powered a lot of the Black Lives Matter stuff and the intolerance of speech that followed from that. But I think that the civil service, and I think that the sort of the respectable opinion of Britain was seizing this chance with the pandemic to take back control, and I think that's what they've done.
Yes, I think I agree with that. There's certainly been I read a lot of the response of the expert class to the pandemic and their seizing of that opportunity to reassert their authority as a sort of riposte to the populist revolts, which resulted in Trump's election, the Brexit victory, and so forth. But the question, I said, that in a way is not surprising. Of course, they'd try and exploit this opportunity to kind of reassert themselves but
it has been coming for some time. It's been coming for some time. So if, for instance, you look back at the terrible Huntingdon gun attack, do you remember when a man ran amok and killed children in Huntingdon? As a result of that, there was then a very strong reaction against handguns. And it went beyond that, though. It went also beyond, and it extended to banning of children's pop guns. And there was an amnesty. A vicar somewhere in Berkshire had an amnesty for children to hand in their pop guns. I mean, ludicrous. But that was the extent. I mean, I'm not saying handguns are a good thing, don't get me wrong, of course. But that was an example of early overkill. I think another example of early overkill was the reaction to Benny Hill, who was tremendously coarse, sort of in the tradition of the McGill Seaside postcards, slap and tickle, sexist humor. Now, Benny Hill suddenly became totally beyond the pale and was driven off television, and you see a few sort of echoes of thunder from quite a long time ago, where this rising intolerance was happening. And I don't know, how can you explain it? Is it because suddenly many more people have been to university and done too much thinking? Thinking is very bad for you. And also, I think perhaps there was this sort of creed, official creed of egalitarianism, where egalitarianism became the absolute must-have, and that egalitarianism is the enemy of color and of difference and of verve and panache. And so a lot of these, I think that those are some of the reasons for this rising tide of intolerance.
So I think I broadly agree, but your analysis prompts two questions.
If you don't agree with me, I'm going to cancel you. I mean, that's another extraordinary thing, isn't it? Cancellation. How can you get cancelled? I mean, it's just rubbish. But I suppose if you look back at time, you can say that the Vatican cancelled Galileo, and he had to recant for having a view that actually turned out to be entirely accurate scientifically. But I mean, cancel culture, what's been going on recently, is completely in line with the Inquisition. It's the Vatican, run amok. I keep on saying run amok.
and I hoped that with the election of Boris Johnson, we were going to see a turning of the tide, that there would be less cancellation, less censoriousness, that Boris's victory was in a sense a victory for Benny Hill populism.
Yeah.
So the question,
quite a lot of similarities between Boris and Benny Hill.
There are, vote Conservative and your wife will have bigger boobs and you'll end up driving a BMW M3 sort of thing.
Yeah.
Benny Hill, if he was a politician, might have said. But the question is, how did Boris cease to be Benny Hill so quickly? How did he allow himself to be captured by the bossocracy almost as soon as it? I mean, normally when a prime minister who stands for something is elected, it takes a few years for them to be completely captured by the establishment, by the kind of civil service. But in Boris's case, it seemed to happen almost within a matter of weeks, which was slightly disappointing. But also, why haven't the public revolted? Seemingly, the Conservatives are going to win a tremendous victory in Hartlepool tomorrow. Why haven't the Red Wall voters who put Boris in Downing Street said, hang on a second, we voted for Benny Hill, not Hattie Jakes?
Yeah, well, maybe the British public is not so freedom loving as we all hoped. But also with Boris, I think the reason is that he loves power. As a prime minister, you always become lost in a bubble of advisors. You don't get out enough. The recent disclosures about him having said that he wanted to resist lockdown, suggests that maybe there was a bit more of the old Boris fighting back. And it might have been even worse if, say, Jeremy Hunt had become Prime Minister. But, you know, I mean, he's a politician. He's not necessarily a philosopher.
Have you been disappointed by his sort of willingness to take up arms in the culture war?
Yeah. Well, actually, I think there is a bit of pushback on the culture war going on, but he's never been the bravest. Boris has never been the bravest. He's always relied on people like you to do that sort of thing. You know, you're the poor schmuck who goes over the top, Toby. And Boris has always been, you know, slightly. He's not quite as bad as the general in Blackadder, right back at the chateau, but he was never exactly leading the charge. No, but I have been a bit disappointed, yeah. And I've been particularly disappointed over the masks thing. The masks are ghastly because they are complete instruments of control and fear. And this is what's happening, is that the masks, the use of masks, which I might sound completely deranged about, but I hate them so much. But I'm afraid that is linked entirely to your cause, ladies and gentlemen, which is free speech. And if you are worried about free speech, you should be fighting against masks for the reason that they are simply instruments of fear. And there's very strong reason to suspect that they actually do bugger all in terms of reducing the spread of the disease. But, you know, the officialdom does not want that out. And the treatment of Carl Heneghan by Facebook, when he was accused, Carl Heneghan, Oxford professor, he wrote a piece in The Spectator about a Danish study which was questioning masks' efficacy. And Facebook said it was false news, and his free speech was absolutely chopped off at the knees like Norman Hunter.
Yeah, no, that was shocking. One of the great enemies of free speech, somewhat surprisingly, who've really kind of cast aside any pretense that they are a force for good when it comes to free speech, is big tech, social media companies like Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, Google more generally. Has that shocked you, the way in which they've completely, I mean, once upon a time, you know, we saw that ad, remember the ad for Apple, in which it was a kind of had a Big Brother theme, and it was someone running towards the screen and smashing Big Brother. Now, big tech is Big Brother. How did that transformation happen?
Well, because they made a lot of money, and they want to keep their money, and they see that politics is quite a good way of keeping that, and they become very political. Zuckerberg at Facebook has become very political. And there was a select committee the other day in the House of Lords where Facebook and Twitter are up, and they're completely open about the use of unqualified fact checkers to shut down Oxford and Harvard scientists. Extraordinary. And they said, well, you know, it's because we think that nobody should be questioning the health authorities. Health officialdom is now trusted more than Harvard and Oxford professors. It's bizarre, but that's because Facebook and Twitter and the other social media companies want to suck up to the governments, keep their money. It's all to do with loot.
One of the reasons I think that we've seen these assaults on our liberty over the past 15 months or so is because of the extraordinary authority enjoyed by, in particular, public health scientists. I mean, we saw a bit of this in the climate change debate. Politicians being willing to do the bidding of those who claim to be speaking with the authority of science. But scientism has become a kind of religion, hasn't it? And do you think that's in part due to the declining authority of the established church? Do you think it's now become a kind of source of meaning and purpose, a source of values for lots of people? And that's why people like Chris Whitty and Patrick Vallance can command the kind of authority that they do and can boss around, you know, elected prime ministers.
I wish I could say, Toby, that I thought the Church of England was that powerful or had ever been that powerful in recent years. I mean, I'm an Anglican. I'm a sort of prayer book Anglican. I think will well be hopeless. But I love the liturgy of the old church, and I love country churches and cathedrals. But no, I don't think the decline of the Church of England's got anything to do with that. I think the decline of Fleet Street has got a lot more to do with it. And Fleet Street, for all its faults and for all its phone tapping and for all its concealed apologies, was a tremendous engine of skepticism, and used to, really promote alternative viewpoints and offer people different viewpoints. And they don't get that from social media, partly because of the construct, the way that social media works is, listening to your friends, but also because journos are naturally disobedient, or were. But I don't know if they are anymore. I mean, I'm pretty disappointed by some modern editors and journalists who are not nearly skeptical enough about lockdown for me. But I do think that the decline of Fleet Street has been, it's been a sorry business for those of us who work in the business, but it's also been very bad for the country.
Yeah, I've been wondering about that too. I mean, and I think we've seen that change in our lifetimes, in our kind of professional lifetimes.
Oh yeah.
Why is it that? Why do you think that's happened? Why have most senior journalists, newspaper editors, senior broadcasters, the editors of news programs on the BBC and Channel 4 and so forth, why have they been so willing to side with the government on this particular issue, on the lockdown? Insofar as they've been critical of the government's management of the pandemic, it's been, well, you didn't lock down soon enough, you didn't lock down hard enough, you lifted the restrictions too quickly. They've been remarkably supine when it comes to,
some of them,
not all of them,
yeah.
Some of them. But why do you think that is? Is it because it's become a kind of much more respectable profession than it was? So now people like, I don't know, Robert Peston see themselves as being in the same class as people like Whitty and Vallance, and therefore are reluctant to.
He sees us immensely superior to them. I don't know. I haven't got a clue. I suspect it's partly to do with the fact that they've lost their confidence a bit because of the declining circulations. Newspapers became too expensive. Cover price wars didn't save them. I don't know. I think it's also got to do with them paying far too much attention to Twitter. I would prevent journalists from reading Twitter. I think it's really unhelpful for them. And I think it's also to do with, maybe they get too close to them. But, newspapers are not as confident as they were because they've lost a lot of readers, partly because of the internet, partly because, of the phone hacking stuff. That wasn't very good.
Mm-hmm. So you've survived various attempts
so far.
Cancel you so far.
You've put my foot in it this evening.
This could be the final
this
straw.
could be the last one. About David Starkey moment.
Crikey. Yeah, even Darren Grimes, I think, now has a non-crime hate incident recorded against his name just for not objecting strongly enough when Starkey said whatever he said. Any tips for people watching as to how do you survive?
Never apologize. Don't apologize. Have you ever apologized? I can't remember.
I think I did.
You did
issue a groveling apology, which did me no good at all.
Don't apologize, because they never take the apology. No. They use it against you. So I mean, if you're in if the manure is flying, as it does occasionally, just keep your head down and say no bloody comment.
I mean, you got into difficulty.
The RSC.
The RSC. Do you want to tell that story?
What happened, ladies and gentlemen, was that I went to review a production at Stratford of a non-Shakespeare play, and it was all right. And but one of the actors, seemed to be completely miscast. He was meant to be playing a Regency Hooray Henry, and he was absolutely no good at it. He was a perfectly good actor, learned his lines and everything like that, and would have been very good in a tragic role or a serious role, but he couldn't do comedy. And this guy was black, and I thought, well, has he been cast because there are these Arts Council box ticking operations going on? So I simply asked, has he been cast because of that? Because the RSC has got a very strong reputation for being right on and all this PC casting. And as a result of asking that question, I was denounced as some sort of member of the Ku Klux Klan, and was also denounced at that night, the following night's Olivier Awards, by everyone who came up. It was a bloodbath. But I stuck to my guns, and I said, well, actually, come on, I'm not racist, but this is a fair question to ask. This is a publicly financed theatre. Are they making bad casting decisions because they're under pressure from the Arts Council to have so many minority actors? And I actually could have thought of at least 2 black actors who would have done that role very well. but they just chose the wrong guy, and it was very glaring bad choice of casting. And at the time, the RSC said we are completely blind in our casting. But the other day, Greg Doran, who runs the RSC, admitted that they are not blind and that they do bear this in mind. So I think my case has been proved now. But at the time of the shitstorm, I just I put on the old tin hat, and actually Paul Dacre at the Daily Mail was very helpful to me and gave me a page in the Mail where Greg Doran then had a page, and there's the for and against, and we came through it just about, but it was pretty unpleasant.
So from that experience, the kind of the lesson would be stick to your guns, don't apologize, stand up for yourself. And then
write a book in which I point out in this book the amount of people who make big money, arts consultants make big money out of encouraging or pretty much forcing subsidized theatre to cast more minority actors. And the minority actors are making very little money. The people who are making the money are these mainly white folk who are running the consultancies and cleaning up as a result of this. And this is the thing about the bossocracy, is that it's this sort of elite who are making tremendously big money out of telling everyone else off that they have to be egalitarian. It's completely, a lot of it's very self-serving.
And I recently wrote a piece for The Spectator about Equity's new rules for drama critics, which have now been endorsed, I believe, by the National Union of Journalists. Part of the inspiration for these new rules was your supposedly racist comment.
Was it? I didn't know. Didn't know I was
RSC
responsible.
Production. Yeah, no, this was cited several times in a kind of elaborate rationale for these new rules. Yeah, and it said, I mean, it's rather confusing. It said
you wrote a very good piece about this, Toby.
Thank you. But it said
Mutual Appreciation Society.
The new rules said critics henceforth have to, quote, avoid referring to immutable characteristics such as age, race, gender, and appearance. And then it said in the next breath, but at the same time, distinguish clearly between different racial and ethnic groups in a production. And I thought to myself, if you want to sort of walk this tightrope, and you're required to distinguish clearly between different racial and ethnic groups in a production, but not allowed to refer to the immutable characteristics of the players on stage, how do you do that? And it struck me that one of the tricks that the bossocracy have up their sleeve is they tell you to do things which it's almost impossible to comply with. The guidance is so baffling and confusing to most ordinary people anyway, even to experienced professionals like you, that you're bound to get tripped up, however carefully you try and follow it.
Well, you just ignore it. But what they do is they use respect as a great tool of suppression of thought, suppression of speech. The mistake that Equity makes is thinking that theatre critics are part of theatre. Well, no, we're not. We're part of journalism. We owe our loyalty to our readers and to that very elusive thing called dramatic truth also. But we are not part of the theatre industry. And it would be a bad day were we to become that, because then we would lose our independence. But the powers that be, officialdom uses this thing called respect, the word respect, in a very sinister way. And there was a case recently where the Vice Chancellor of Cambridge University, Stephen Tombs, he tried to force on all Cambridge academics that they had to be respectful of the diverse identities of others. Now, there was a big hoo-ha about this, and Tombs was defeated thanks to the brilliant Stephen Fry and also to Arif Ahmed, who's part of the Free Speech Union. But there you have respect being used, compulsory respect. You have to respect everyone. But what that means is that respect is being used as a brake on expression of freedom. And it's sort of demanding respect with menaces. And this is the way that a lot of the minority grievance industry operates. And they demand respect. They're like someone in the old rear view mirror, beeping their horn, saying, you bloody well let us pass and respect us. Otherwise, we're going to drive you off the road. And I'm afraid that's what Equity is doing. And it's typically gutless of the National Union of Journalists. They've gone along with that.
Right.
You can shut up now.
Yeah, we'll set up. People can ask questions now, Jan.
Yes, there's loads of questions. The chat's going mad.
Harumphing.
And we've got lots of questions in the Q&A as well. I will just take a few, if that's okay, because there's so many to come in, and then Toby and Quentin can come back. Obviously, some of these are very Free Speech Union questions, so they might choose to answer those in another event. A lot of the questions that are coming in are very much about the Free Speech Union itself, so we might organise another event at which people can put those kinds of questions. This kind of experiment with this format was intended to be a bit lighter, just because we thought we don't want to do a serious thing if we're experimenting with this format, but obviously there's some serious questions coming up, but maybe ones that are specifically about the FSU, we might want to consider having another event that's just for members where you can raise this kind of thing. I'm not saying that Toby won't answer that, but just to prepare people.
Hectoring doesn't happen in the arts. I wish we had the sort of Italian culture of people booing at the opera, but you never get that. If you do a bad review, you get looked at like you've let off terribly, and next time you turn up at the theatre, you're ignored by the other critics for writing, or some of the other critics, not Lloyd in The Spectator, who's brilliant, but there's a terrible orthodoxy afoot. Toby, I don't know, how did comedy become like that? Well, I think the BBC's answer, largely to answer, became too political. Why does comedy have to be so unceasingly political? It used to be much better. It was like the two Ronnies, but then I really do sound like an old fart when I'm saying
I do think that there is some cause for hope when it comes to woke comedy. I mean, I think it's very difficult to be both woke and funny. And I don't get the impression that woke comedians are kind of commanding huge houses or are particularly popular. I mean, we saw that if you compare the Oscars last year, where what was it? Did Ricky Gervais actually host the Oscars, or was it
something? It wasn't Oscars.
The Golden Globes, but the Oscars this year, I think, got only 25% of the ratings of the Oscars last year, and even the Oscars last year were kind of got pitifully poor ratings. And it's a question, I think, of get woke, go broke. And so you see that in some cases where the entertainment industry, including comedians, try and be politically correct, viewers are just turning away in droves.
My God, Little Britain couldn't happen now, could it?
No,
either, Toby. I mean, it just couldn't happen because it was so refreshingly incorrect, Little Britain. But then look at the stars of Little Britain, and they made fortunes. So maybe the wokies are going to look at that and think, oh, we wouldn't mind a few more, maybe.
I think we have been thinking about strategy. We've been trying to coordinate with other groups that are also pro-free speech. We've set up a bi-weekly coordination call so we can sing from the same hymn sheet. I think part of the strategic aim of the Free Speech Union is to let people know that if they say something controversial and an outrage mob comes for them, we'll have their back, we'll protect them, we'll do our best to make sure they aren't cancelled. And in that way, encourage more people to speak out and speak their minds. I think so much of the power of the bossocracy, of the woke inquisition, it derives from the fear of people who feel isolated, that if they speak out, the mob will come for them. I think a lot of preference falsification is going on. So if you look at one of the interesting things about the collapse of the Soviet Union and its Eastern European satellites towards the end of the 1980s, is that until it happened, everyone assumed that the communist ideology in those countries commanded the support of their populations. But when the Berlin Wall fell, those regimes collapsed like dominoes, because in fact, as soon as people felt empowered to say what they really thought, as soon as they no longer lived in fear of being targeted if they spoke out, suddenly it became clear that they enjoyed no legitimacy at all. And if we can empower people, if we can embolden them to speak out a little bit, to be slightly less scared, then I think that will contribute enormously to the collapse of the woke cult. At the moment, it's in the ascendancy, but I think in due course, it will collapse.
Can I just say, actually, Toby, it already has. And your organization, ladies and gentlemen, those of you watching who are members, has already helped those of us who feeling under the cosh, who write stuff, already makes us feel that there is a bit of hope. And strategy always sounds to me a rather sinister thing. I know soldiers always want strategy, but you don't want to be too planned out on this, because part of the sort of the delight of the Free Speech Union is that you are not like all these scheming so-and-sos, and you are you're properly liberal in you're speaking extempore without sort of some sort of strategy. But you know, the fact that you are there already really does help.
And we also hope to open branches across the Anglosphere, and the New Zealand branch of the Free Speech Union.
The Hong Kong branch may not take off.
Maybe not the Hong Kong branch, but we hope to open branches in Australia, America, South Africa, Canada in due course. And as I say, the New Zealand branch opened yesterday, so that's a cause for hope. The union question I thought was very good, and I think it is noticeable that trade unions now won't stick up for their members who dissent from fashionable orthodoxy in a way that they did in the past. I mean, one of the inspirations, one of the wellsprings of the trade union movement in the 19th century was protecting workers who wanted to challenge their bosses and vote differently to the way they were told to vote by their bosses. It was to protect the free speech of workers, and that objective seems to have fallen by the wayside. I do think, as you say, there are some good independent trade unions which will stand up for you. I know the Workers of England Union, for instance, has been defending a number of people in the healthcare sector who are resistant to being vaccinated as a condition of their continuing employment. They've taken on a number of those cases. We also work with another trade union called Affinity, which again is an independent, non-partisan trade union, and it is willing to stick up for people who are being punished just for having an unfashionable view. And I think more broadly, one of the things the Free Speech Union is going to campaign for is a bit more freedom for workers. So at the moment, employers think they can police the speech of their employees. They have these draconian social media policies which say if you say anything, even in a purely private capacity, which we think could reflect badly and affect our reputation, then we reserve the right to discipline you and in some cases sack you. We think that's wrong, that there should be a clear, bright line dividing people's public persona when they're wearing their hats as employees and their private life. And we don't think that employers should be able to police what people say in the pub, on Facebook, on WhatsApp. And I think we need legislation to strengthen employees' free speech rights. And that's going to be something we'll be campaigning for in due course. I think wanting to exclude some people from being able to participate in public debates because you regard their views as beyond the pale has a very destructive, polarizing effect. And I think we saw this in America under Trump. And it's in some ways revealing that Trump's presidency ended with the storming of the Capitol building. I think that was illustrative of the fact that if you do cast out a certain section of the population, if you say that people who voted for Trump, American patriots, people who haven't been to college for the most part, people who have quite traditional views about the family, if you say that those people are no longer entitled to participate in public debates, they can't take part in these conversations anymore, they're beyond the pale, then of course you're going to make them feel disempowered and alienated, and we're going to see the kind of explosion that we saw in the Capitol towards the end of January of this year. And I think that is a really good illustration of how the restrictions on free speech, the assault on free speech, has been really bad for the health of politics, both here and in America. There was a law passed in 1996, the 1996 Education Act, and section, I think, 247 of that law says that when teachers teach children about politically contentious things, they're supposed to do it in an even-handed, balanced way. In other words, they have a legal duty not to present these issues in a completely one-sided, partisan way. So why then isn't that legal duty being observed? And I think there are probably three reasons. I sound like Keir Starmer now, but the first reason is that I think a lot of teachers don't regard this content as political. When they're kind of parroting the BLM narrative about systemic racism in British institutions, they don't think that's political. They think that's objective fact, and that anyone disputing it would be a racist. And why do you need to give, why do you need to be even-handed between racists and non-racists? That's one reason. A second reason is that a lot of teachers, I think, just aren't aware that they're legally obliged to discuss these issues, introduce children to these issues in a balanced, even-handed way. They don't know about the 1996 Education Act. And the third reason is, I think some teachers know it's political, they know they're not supposed to be doing it, but they don't care, because one of the reasons they got into teaching is to promote social justice. And they think, until I'm stopped, I'm going to carry on indoctrinating children in my care, because that's important. We're going to create a better society that way. And the Free Speech Union is, we've had a lot of members write to us to complain about their children being taught in a very one-sided way, not just about BLM, but about other issues too, like colonialism, Winston Churchill, about the pandemic, and so forth. And we've just composed a letter to someone in the DFE, pointing out all these examples of children being taught in a very biased, one-sided way about a whole cluster of issues. And we hope that that will have some impact. We'll see in due course. Just finally,
a letter, Toby. A letter's not going to do anything.
Well, we've had some success with letters, but anyway. I think the reason for that is it has a lot in common with non-conformism, with non-Catholic manifestations of Christianity. So the Anglosphere, I think, because of its breach with Rome during the Tudor period, means that it's become much more. It means that it has this kind of Protestant, non-conformist, non-Catholic kind of quality, which makes it much more susceptible to these kind of puritanical movements. I think that must have something to do with it. And one of the characteristics of the woke cult is it has a lot in common with some of the least attractive aspects of Christianity. I mean, you can see an early manifestation of cancel culture were the witch hunts in 17th century Salem in Massachusetts, and I think that unfortunately it hasn't taken on board this distinction between the sin and the sinner, or the idea of forgiveness, of leaving a sort of avenue for people who've been excommunicated to become rehabilitated and bring them back into the fold. It's like the nastiest aspects of kind of Protestant Puritanism, and I think that's why it's taken root in the Anglosphere to a greater extent than elsewhere. That's my theory, anyway. Why does the left see this as a kind of right-wing cause? Why doesn't the left care more about free speech? And actually, there's an interesting essay in Quentin's book in which he talks about the Mary Whitehouse paradox. back in the 1960s, it was Christian conservatives who were the kind of puritanical censors, people like Mary Whitehouse, and the left who were the champions of free speech and liberty. And now that's been completely reversed. And it's male, pale and stale conservatives like me and Quentin who champion liberty and free speech, and people on the left, left-wing activists like Owen Jones, who are the new censors wielding their red pens and wagging their fingers in our faces. Why has that happened? I mean, it's an extraordinary transformation. But as you say, I don't think it is universally true on the left. Lots of people, I think, who've joined the Free Speech Union, who get in touch with me say, you know, I'm on the left. I'm a Guardian reader. I voted for Remain. But by God, I think free speech is important and what you're doing is important. So even though we disagree about lots of things, I'm at one with you on this. And it's heartening to get those letters. And I'm sure there are lots of people like you on the left who think free speech is important. Ira Glasser, the legendary ex-head of the American Civil Liberties Union, he made a very good point about this. He said that speech restrictions are a bit like poison gas. You know, when you've got the enemy in your sights on the battlefield, you think, I'll release the poison gas. But what they don't realize is that the wind can change. And I think to win this argument, to get more people on the left on side, we need to persuade them that, okay, the wind may be in their sails at the moment and speech restrictions may favor them and not their opponents, but the wind could change. And if you've allowed free speech restrictions to be imposed, it'll be much harder to stop them being imposed on you in due course. We need to persuade people on the left, like Owen Jones, that defending free speech is as much in their interests as it's in the interests of people like me and Quentin.
I think it's much more to do with pounds, shillings and pence, and it's to do with the elite wanting loot. And there was an advertisement in my book, I hasten to add, a very good book, I mentioned that there was an advertisement for the Trussell Trust, which is a charity to do with food banks, was advertising for a diversity and inclusion manager. Do you know how much they're paying? 62,000 quid a year. I mean, think how many tins of baked beans that would buy. And that is typical of that sort of job. A tremendously rich pickings. If you subscribe to this woke creed, you're in beans. You really are. I think it's much more selfish than anything to do with left and right. And I think what the response and the Free Speech Union should be trying to do, here we come to our strategy perhaps, is to marry the old hippies. The old hippies were great in the 1960s. I was always on their side as a young man, and they've now got much more in common with the old Colonel Blimps, the sort of the tomato corduroy brigade in the shires. They and the old hippies were marrying up or teaming up, you know, smoking a spliff and having a gin and tonic, a pink gin at the same time.
The curious thing about the predicament we're in now is that scientists are in the role of the Catholic Church. It's scientism has become the faith that we're all expected to embrace. So it's a slightly, but you said that facts always lose when facts come into conflict with faith, but actually, you know, we now do think that the sun is the center of the universe, not the earth. So Galileo's view did prevail eventually. And my hope is that as the damage of the lockdowns becomes more and more apparent, when furlough ends, unemployment soars, when we return to the high street and see so many names we're familiar with closed, that gradually the public mood, and also when, you know, Downing Street isn't pumping out kind of fear-inducing propaganda on a nightly basis, that eventually the public mood will turn and people will, when they sort of recover their senses, begin to look in a more empirical way at the data. There will eventually be a kind of terrible reckoning in which people think, crikey, this is one of the worst mistakes that governments across the world have made in ever dealing with a crisis. And I hope at that point, you know, that we'll see another populist revolt, which will make the Brexit revolt look like a Vickers Tea Party, but that remains to be seen. And I think Graham Brady's been good. Desmond Swain's been good.
Oh, Swain's magnificent.
Swain's magnificent.
Swain is magnificent. Swain is the one with Bugger's Grips, and who wears a scarf and takes off his scarf because he won't wear a mask. And I love Swain. John Speller on the Labour bench has been pretty good. There's a Tory called William Ragg, who is about 32 and looks about 60. And he runs the Public Administration Select Committee, and he's been quite good. Sammy Nelson of the DUP. Wee Sammy. And there was also briefly, the only woman on the list I can think of is, and I can't remember her name, a Lib Dem for St Albans, who at one point, she was a Lib Dem who was actually saying things liberal. And she was speaking up for the reopening of pubs quite well. So I tried to mention
Charles Walker.
Charles Walker has been fantastic too, yeah. But there are not many of them, being deplorably few. I don't think it is about faith. I think the poor old church come in far too much flack this evening. And Protestants, the idea of Protestantism is that you yourself confront God, and therefore it's creating much more individual worshippers. I don't buy all that, Toby. But I would say to Kieran, it's not about faith, it's to do with loss of face. And it's to do with the politicians. Look at Starmer. Starmer hasn't been nearly oppositional enough. And he's not going to, I don't think he's going to prosper as a result. And you look at someone like Priti Patel, this has just appealed to her authoritarian instincts. I mean, it's not been quite goose-stepping, but it hasn't been far short of that, some of Priti's stuff. And I just think that it's the politicians work themselves into a position and then are determined not to change their minds. And we were giving Boris some like earlier. The thing about Boris is he always allows himself a way out of things, and he's slightly better. And he's been U-turning like mad. But there is something to be said for a politician who will reconsider and say, okay, we're going to change our mind about that. Well, I think Stephen Fry is pretty woke in many respects. He's pretty, he's a proper liberal guy, but he sort of appeals to the wokies. But he's been very brave, Stephen has, in standing up to some of the free speech atrocities. And also the Harry Potter woman, I've forgotten her name now, Rowling. She's come a terrible, she's been treated terribly by the woke people, and yet she herself is fairly right on. So I hope that those two might sort of come out, be used a bit more as slightly sort of examples of how you can be good.
I think it's generally true that there is something a bit miserablist about the wokerati. You don't see them having fun. I mean, and that's why often one of the most effective ways of getting at them is comedy. So Andrew Doyle, a member of the Free Speech Union's Legal Advisory Council, who's also Titania McGrath on Twitter, and also co-hosts this comedy club called Comedy Unleashed, where the Free Speech Union had a couple of comedy nights at the end of last year. His kind of taking the mickey out of the woke, particularly via Titania McGrath, is extraordinarily effective, much more effective than trying to sort of engage with them in kind of reasonable, rational debate. I mean, as a free speech unionist, I'm all in favor of reasonable, evidence-based, logical discussion. But if you want to denude the kind of new Puritans of their authority, a bit of Mickey taking seems to be much more effective. Right. You know, it really wrong foots them because they are naturally rather kind of miserable and serious.
But it has to be said that some right-wing freedom fighters can be pretty boring too. John Redwood is not the funniest man in the world. And I used to go to lunches at the Institute for Economic Affairs, great Thatcherite freedom think tank. And they were some of the driest, stodgiest lunches I've ever been to. So, yeah, take the mickey by all means, but also, you know, just take the mickey generally out of people, I think, in a kind and Christian way.
Yes. Okay, I think that's a good note to end on. But before everyone goes, I just wanted to say thank you very much for being members of the Free Speech Union. You ask what you can do. to try and fight back against all the attacks on free speech. And I think just by being members of the Free Speech Union and enabling this organization to exist and employ case officers and a chief legal counsel means that, you are doing quite a lot already. We are there now able to operate and come to people's defense and write letters and do other things too, to stand up for free speech, which we wouldn't be able to do if you hadn't become members and you weren't paying your membership dues. So thank you for that. Just to say, I hope you're enjoying the weekly and monthly newsletters. You're finding them informative and not too depressing. We will be having another of these speakeasies, as Jan said, in a couple of months. And then next month, Redo Tylercoats and others will be talking about what we can do to oppose the online safety bill, which, as Jan said, poses a pretty serious threat to free speech. Thank you very much. If you're inclined to, one of our fights is trying to get the police to stop investigating and recording non-crime hate incidents. Something I talk about a lot, but over the past 5 years, police forces in England and Wales have recorded 120,000 non-crime hate incidents. That's an average of 66 a day. Not surprising that so few burglaries are being solved when they're so busy interviewing people about misgendering other people on Twitter.
And many of them are reported by police officers about alleged hate crimes against police officers. So it's the police generating business for themselves.
Anyway, please, if you have any spare cash, donate to our GoFundMe litigation fund, because Harry Miller, the brave ex-copper who's taken on the College of Policing, whose guidance the police are following when they record these non-crime hate incidents, his appeal court hearing was a couple of weeks ago. The verdict's about to be announced, but if it goes against him, he'll be saddled with an enormous bill for hundreds of thousands of pounds, and we're going to help him pay that if we can through that litigation fund. So anyway, thank you very much for tuning in. Don't forget about Quentin's fantastic new book. And Quentin, just to say thank you very much for being our first Free Speech Union speakeasy guest.
Great pleasure.
Fantastic.
Great pleasure.
Great, thanks very much, guys. So keep your ears out for upcoming events. We'll be emailing you all about the one in June on that Toby mentioned. That's called an FSU In Depth, and then we've got the July speakeasy with Kathleen Stock. I'm pretty sure we'll try and slot Harry Miller in here somewhere as his case comes into the public eye again. So thanks very much. I'm going to end this now, but I note the hunger amongst the audience for continuing conversation, so we will try and find a way of allowing you or giving you a space where you can all talk amongst yourself, if not in the pub, but hopefully it would be in a pub soon. Thanks very much. Good night.